So, yes, it's a great pleasure to be here and talk about ideas on minorities and globalization. Do evidence some reflexive actions that influences these European discourses on cohesion, citizenship, and environment. And I'll go through these three discourses in a moment. But first, a few words on the reflective actor. I apologize for the many slides, but I hope it's helpful. I will try to speak slowly so you don't get entirely lost in my attempt to explain a few concepts here. But according to Anthony Giddens, the reflexive actor clearly draws on quite a strong, if you will, individual autonomy. Immigrants, long-term residents or newcomers, citizens or non-citizens, with or without legal, with or without a passport, if you will. This kind of thinking actually is a concept or theory that can be ascribed to many types of minorities. And as we've already heard, of course, in our trade, in our business, we sometimes distinguish between old and new minorities. These are purely for analytical purposes. They really should not be used in the public discourse, but they are helpful for students, of course, and we do use them with our students. They may just be residents. They're not necessarily legally approved as citizens, but they are active in their local communities, and they actually do, through their actions and through their networking and through their institutions, they create, he argues, they create a social, possibilities for social transformation in regions, seeking to use their cultural power to preserve their region, to preserve their culture, to make their regions also intercultural and diverse, to make their countries diverse. And this, of course, is, I mean, it's a pluralist view. It's drawn on, of course, the now well-known concept that there is a hybrid identity in many minorities today. But what it adds to the picture, and what I find very important, is here that they argue that there is also multi-loyalty. Certainly, kin-state minorities nowadays, at least in Western Europe, clearly show dual loyalty to the kin-state as well as to the home state. This is the situation in many of the border regions in Europe, and it works quite well, at least in our region. And it's basically developed on the back of these many institutions that minorities, small minorities in Europe have. These are not institutions that are necessarily entrenched in high law and constitutions. And here, my argument is that, especially in the regions, whether we are talking about regional minorities, kin-state minorities, indigenous groups living in their traditional homelands, there is a tremendous evidence of show of concern for the land, for the survival of the land, because the territory that they live in give them nurture for their identity. And here I draw on the theory of William Conley, an American philosopher, who argues that the territory that we live in, for the most part, of course it may not see for all. There are some true cosmopolitans around, but he truly believes, and I agree with him, that our homeland gives us an identity. It nurtures our identity. It can also be problematic, but it certainly gives us a certain nurture. And for that reason, using this, I argue that minorities and indigenous peoples nowadays show this in real life. I call them green minorities. That's probably not very politically correct, but certainly we see evidence of this both in the Zapatistas communities in Mexico, trying to preserve the agricultural ways. We see it in the indigenous people in Canada as well as in Alaska, actually knowing more about how to manage their territory than the white man. Forgive me my French. But this is actually what has been evidenced, that if indigenous peoples are allowed to create strategies for their own land, it's oftentimes done much better than if the prevailing powers do this. But in Europe we also have strong and stronger tendencies to be worried about the homeland territory. We've seen it in our small border region. We've seen it even in South Tyrol. They speak about green slopes, not because there's no snow, but because those slopes are really managed with green energy. And of course, in northern Scandinavia, the Sami people, they are very active for protecting not only their own livelihood and their traditional ways of life, but also for telling the general majority public that there is a purpose of protecting these areas. Not always with luck, of course, but certainly, I think, very honorable attempts to speak to this discourse in Europe. And I think it's oftentimes forgotten in the general majority debate. So, to come to a conclusion, the argument again that I've been trying to make is basically that I do think these new narratives show that minorities are reflexive in terms of bringing together the social, the cultural, and the political in their action. I do think we have some new discourses that are much more interesting to follow than the traditional security and justice discourse, which a lot of my own work still centers around that, and there are certain institutions in Europe that just cannot get beyond these. That, of course, there's of course a reason, because there are still many minorities who are in dire straits and who need the external support for protection of their existence, their cultural ways, their language, and so forth. So I'm not trying to degrade this, I'm just saying we need to think in terms of new methodology. This is basically what I'm going to come to here at the end. New ways of thinking of citizenship, new ways of thinking of environmental green identities. And for this reason, my argument is that I think we're at a threshold. I think we need to start looking for new terms of reference for how we study minorities. This is something, of course, I have the luxury to talk about because I've been in this trade for quite some years now. But I do think we need to look for new tools that describe exactly what are the minorities doing. Because even in those areas where you could say globalization is still a gloomy picture for minorities, and we know it is, certainly at the global scale, but also in Europe. But even in those areas, I see evidence of the reflexive citizen. in northern Scandinavia, in Eastern Europe. I see it. So my argument is we need new tools for dialectics. We need new tools for seeing how individuals are reflexive. We need to be critical in our thinking. I mean, we have good scholars arguing for critical thinking on culture. I mean, I'm thinking of Anne Phillips, Don't Essentialize Culture. I'm thinking of Roger Brubaker and the groupism argument, and so forth. I mean, there are definitely good scholars helping us with this. And then I believe we need to think very much how to begin to explain this. And forgive me just to read more specifically. I think that critical theory must be explanatory, practical, and normative at the same time. It must explain what is wrong with the current social reality, identity. It must explain the actors trying to change this. And it must provide both clear norms for criticism and achievable practical goals for social transformation. It must focus on human beings as producers of their own historical form of life. That's why I think searching for reflexive action is a good beginning. And I also think it's a good beginning to critique some of these mediocre theories we heard on very early on about end of history, end of nation state, end of ideology, class of civilizations, what have you. And my suggestion, therefore, is that specifically with regard to cultural minorities, this will include searching for the new narratives of political action as well as intercultural power, of acts of citizenship and transnational minority capital, as well as ecological identities based on territory. And by putting these narratives in contact with the so-called meta-discourses of social and political changes, it seems more likely that new behavior is detected, and perhaps new theories of cultural minority power become clearer. So with this I say thank you, and merci.